Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live edition of the Out of the Woods Threat Hunting podcast. Today we have a fun show. We're going to be covering kind of what we've been covering with this podcast in 2025 from all the different sources and materials that we've reviewed and gone over. And we tried to basically put in like a year-end review of patterns that we've seen, some of the things that we think are pertinent or interesting. So Tom did a good job pulling things together, and we kind of like the idea of doing this. Kind of like focusing on what everyone else is typically seeing and what we're able to pick apart from a threat hunter perspective. So hopefully there'll be some things that will align with some people, and so hopefully there will be some feedback from our Discord where people can join and chat too. So we'd also really enjoy hearing what other people were seeing through 2025. If we didn't mention a trend that maybe someone else did to add to the conversation, that would be awesome and great. Before we kick off, some quick introductions. I'm Scott Pulley. I'm a threat hunter at Intel 471. Been threat hunting for numerous years now and have been in the security space for quite some time. You're more than welcome to link up with me on LinkedIn, and you can check out any other experience there. I guess I'll pass it off to Tom.
Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Costura. I am a threat hunt analyst here at Intel 471. Been in the field about 15 years now, and just really love this stuff. We love talking shop, love talking defender side stuff. So ready for this conversation. Lee?
Yeah, hey, it's a pleasure to meet you all. Name's Lee. I was a SOC analyst for about 5 years, IT admin prior to that. And then I've been a threat hunter for the past 5 years, helping customers mature and, taking a look at their process and see what we can do better, if anything.
Awesome. So, Tom, I think since you put this thing together, we'll let you drive everything and just kind of kick us into what it is we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm gonna kind of do my best MC version here and help guide us through the track. These guys are gonna apply their expertise to a lot of the topics, and we're just going to kind of talk shop. But just a little to preface the before we kind of get started into the different topics. All the data points that we're looking at and we discuss and we kind of show throughout the show, they are pulled from specifically from the Out of the Woods podcast shows throughout the course of the year. So just a little bit of an insight to that. The weekly shows that we do, we're researching many articles. So we talk about 4 every show, usually weekly. And throughout the course of 2025, we covered down on 100 specific topics, articles, blog points that we discussed. Breaking those down a little bit, 76 of those 100 were specifically directed towards attack type articles. So things that actually showed compromise, attack patterns, behaviors, things like that. The remaining were more of awareness type articles. So we always bring in different topics of the time, try to, apply a little more to the show to, talk about things that are up and coming, potential things, AI, stuff like that. But the data points in this are specifically from the 76 articles. Just as a little backing point, I'd say, and I think it's very fair to say, because we do research a lot. We're constantly researching, almost like breathing to us most of the time. Out of those 100 articles, those were probably straight from, Scott, I think it's fair to say between me, you, and even Lee, throughout the year, we've looked through well over 1,000 articles, 1,000 different pieces of intel. So we always pull out pieces that we think are relevant. We're really trying to drive talking about hunting, but we do expand beyond that. But just a little preface so everyone knows what the data is for. So, go ahead.
I was say that one of the good parts about this too is, I mean, basically all the stuff we're seeing, we're hoping that one, it's open source based, right? So everyone else can kind of come across the same things and take the same approaches. But two, the other thing is a lot of the things we talk about, because we're kind of weekly crawling things, we try to hit those like newsworthy events sometimes as well. So the things that you would expect, maybe leadership and things to come across and ask questions about. So we're always trying to address that kind of thing. So out of those trends and that visibility, it's kind of interesting what we kind of came across.
Yeah, and the data really kind of came together nicely, I thought. And hopefully, everyone listening or anyone participating is able to be able to take something away from that as well. We love the data stuff. We love seeing trends. We like seeing where things are going. We try to get to that place where we can think proactively versus reactively as often as possible. But yeah, so kind of kicking it off. And I'll touch on these, and I want to see what you guys think. But one of the key things to start with is we did see a few really specific themes throughout the course of the entire year. Lull bins were everywhere, right? And we'll be talking about that throughout the show. But lull bins were a constant. We definitely started seeing a lot of different supply chain and kind of that trusted relationship abuse throughout a lot of the stuff we've seen. Some really novel stuff, really creative stuff that we dug into a lot, even on our side and our daily work. Looking at some of the identity and persistence stuff that is it's constant, it's still routine, and you're going to see some of that reflected in other items we talked about. And then the AI topic has been increasingly growing, and that's expected, right? Rightfully so. So we're going to have some pointers and stuff to talk about on that. But yeah, Lee or Scott, anything you guys want to touch on this before we start really diving into the data points?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because we always see and hear living off the land, and I've always, I want to say, constantly push the persistence and execution tactics of MITRE as like always a great place to focus. And with the living off the land, you're always going to at least see like malware and things can execute themselves, right? So there's going to be something that drives that almost every time. So I feel like living off the land is always a piece of something. Like I don't think there's ever really many attacks that don't have any of that involved. So that's you.
So add on to what Polly said. I mean, they're always involved, and it's funny because whenever they're not involved, then you got masquerading to make it look like they're involved. So it's something, it's just like, that was it SCB host or instead of SVC, like it's always around. So if you're not paying attention to lull bins, please start. Also, a thing that comes along with that is the elevated privileges sometimes whenever these tools are run, that they just have more privileges. And that's why adversaries are targeting them, right? So if you're not hunting for them, I'd start.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the lull bins are really, I don't know. I think after the course of this year and really like the amount of stuff that we dug into, the lull bin side and that's really the absolute for almost all the attacks, right? That's a framework that is absolute in almost every attack. Very seldomly do we see anything happening where a lull bin is not leveraged, touched, or abused. But yeah, so hopefully we can demonstrate that more as we go.
And
so
I did.
Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to touch on the last point there, the AI related stuff. I really like to see how there was that huge push at the beginning when AI was coming out, and the fear associated with now attacks are going to become easier. And people were assuming that attacks were going to be all AI driven. There were some really creative attacks, right, where people actually leveraged some AI LLM tools to kind of facilitate what was going to be run and go back and forth. But ironically, those were kind of easy to defend against because you would see the API usage calling out to those tools as like a really key telemetry. So it was like a very unique way to say, well, there's something weird going on here anyways, if you have that telemetry. So those attacks weren't really, I would say, super effective or had the ability to even get more and more effective. But the big thing that we kind of were predicting already was just the multiplier, right? Like the fact that now people have ways to get better at their skills, think of new ways to do the same thing, which as even defenders, I think we use it that way as well. So it was good to see that align with where our heads were at initially. And also good to see that it wasn't just going to be this letting this cat out of the bag and just chaos in general. So.
Absolutely. Okay. We're going to kick it into the first kind of main topic so we're going to talk about tactics. So in the slide that's shown, you can kind of see, and it's just an echo of the data points we pulled from, but it was interesting to me, Scott and Lee, that the amount of the tactics observed over the entirety of everything we were looking at, where some of the things fell. Honestly, one point that stood out to me when I looked at this data is I honestly expected persistence to be higher. Especially when we, at least it felt like it because we were talking about it every week. I thought persistence would be higher mainly because we've seen a lot of attacks really implement multiple layers of persistence. So you've seen multiple pieces there, and I just thought that we might have more of that. But we really it was interesting to me. But that's just one point I took from it. I want to hear what you guys have to say about this one.
So yeah, if I could preface, or all right, Polly. Oh yeah, if I could preface something about this data, and not to say it's skewed or wrong or anything, but if you think about, and first of all, I like how it naturally flows from almost like to the left of the attack chain to the right, if you will. Impact being the least, which is great because people aren't waiting for that ransom note to execute to start hunting for. But if you think about execution, like execution is everything, all right? Any code that runs is technically execution. What we have to figure out is more of the intent on like why it's being executed and what's its end goal. And that's where I've liked that it like naturally slides to the right because looking at, PowerShell encoded commands or scheduled tasks being created, all that involves some living off land binaries, execution being done. But and then have a multi coverage of tactics where it was execution, but at the same time, it's maintaining persistence. So I take that with a little grain of salt. But I do like the natural flow that we're looking for those things. And I agree with you, Tom, that persistence is very important to look after because, I mean, if you can make them have to try and reinfect a machine, then that's making it twice as hard. If you can get them out of the machine, get their foothold, out of the way, then they have to go somewhere else. But again, I like that it's expanding or that it's spreading the whole MITRE ATT&CK matrix versus everything's an execution, defense evasion, and collection versus nothing elsewhere. So I'm happy with the spread.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think what we see here too is a little bias on the reporting in general, only because one, it's like open source, so sometimes not everything is divulged. And so sometimes you see these reports and they really focus on like certain aspects. And the other thing too is a lot of times the impact isn't explained because some of the reports come from vendors and tools, right? They want to demonstrate how effective their tools are. So like we were able to stop this, but this is what we learned, right? Um, so what's good about that though, especially from a threat hunting perspective, is even just focusing, on how they stopped an attack gives you really good approaches for what maybe you should look for, laterally in your environment as well. So I think that's why we sometimes draw into those reports because there's enough technical detail there. But yeah, I mean, I think the defense evasion execution, a lot of especially malware campaigns that we saw through 2025, defense evasion, it was like a key thing because there was always that how do I land, what do I identify as far as what defensive tools exist and then what actions follow. There's a lot of reports that contain that kind of trending behavior. So I'm kind of not surprised that defense evasion is so high because even if there wasn't like really advanced techniques for that, there was just that consistent part of learning the environment was just doing those few steps of defense evasion. So yeah.
And I thought we've seen a lot of unique stuff from defense evasion, right? We've seen some stuff that was, not the run of the mill things. A lot of attackers trying different things that were, kind of classified under those tactics. One reference point I really liked, and I believe this was an article you brought to the table, Scott, was earlier in the year talking about Chili Hell, which was focused on more on the Mac OS side. But a few things that they did in that, like they leveraged timestamps. They leveraged the payload and data obfuscation. That was more common. But they also did like code sign abuse, right? So we've seen that they would actually have they worked to make the malware actually Apple notarized, so it could bypass that gate. And then also, kind of the masquerading techniques that we've seen kind of evolve on the Mac OS side, because Mac OS started kind of scaling through the year. At least I did.
It grew a lot, especially with info stealers as
yeah, yeah. So there was some unique stuff there.
So okay, ask something else. I've got it, boy.
No, you're good.
I would say if you look at the like one tactic that kind of like sticks out to me, exfiltration being a little low. Um, and if we're thinking about reports from the wild and stuff, like sometimes I think sometimes you got to think about um, what can be detected and what can be hunted on, pending, do you have the telemetry? Do you have the log visibility? Do you have all that stuff? So naturally, I think this tells a story of, what most people have or access to, what types of tactics they can look to, and then kind of like scrape together what they can at the end, or any other tactics that they went on for, but they really can't.
Yeah, there's a lot, and I was even looking at something just recently actually with the eBPF, and eBPF is like all kind of like the syscalls on Linux and Unix. And what's interesting is there are like other kind of tooling and things you can get to monitor that, but um, a lot of rootkits and things were leveraging eBPF hooks to basically get rootkits in place or leverage that to like advance further in the attack chain. Um, and it's just interesting to see kind of that development from a defense evasion because a lot of like rootkitting behaviors I don't feel like we're seeing as often, but it seems to be growing more in the Linux Mac space a little more as of late as well. So knowing that we were seeing this in 2025 and now early 2026 starting to see even more of it is kind of an interesting take.
Yeah, I think especially on the Linux side of the house, right? So when you talk defense evasion, a lot of times I think historically, at least from my perspective, we would see payloads, artifacts being dropped and then quickly removed, usually followed up with some kind of a history clear, right? But what we did see in quite a few of the Linux focused, the Linux side focused attacks, though, is the increased leverage of hidden artifacts. And I think that that kind of like actually plays to 2 points, at least from the stuff we've seen, Scott. Um, Using hidden files can enable you to do some of that defensive evasion and find a way to dodge those initial forensics kind of tracks or that initial detection tracks in different ways. But it also does lend a way to persistence as well.
Yeah. The one thing too that I think it's interesting is I know Discovery kind of hit low as far as tactics, but what's interesting about Discovery is I feel like reports will have Discovery in it sometimes and sometimes kind of not. But when it does have Discovery, it's like a lot of activity, right? So in a weird way, it's like when Discovery's there, like it's present. And so it might be look a little skewed there from a numbers perspective, because I'm sure if you were to do like how much Discovery is in a report and compare like that, that that could be bigger. But um, so Discovery is one of those things I think is always kind of an easy thing to look at as long as you're looking at it the right way, like a lot of activity in a short window and things like that. Because usually discovery, it's not really as effective if it's just like one piece, or two pieces. Usually you're trying to get like a quick snapshot, an understanding of what's going on in an environment, and then following actions after that. So um, also really effective to be looking for.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to bridge into something else on the tactics piece before we move on to the technique side. Um, and I'm going to talk about persistence. So I guess I'm coming off a little biased on this one, but there's a reason. So Scott and I throughout the years, a lot of the shows that we did, we would always kind of laugh and hark on that we found these things that were continuously seen. Um, and it wasn't wordplay. And we honestly, wholeheartedly, never looked for these things. They just are always appearing. Anyone that's listened to the show before knows that Scott's got a bit of a nickname for like the single character executables, single character files, because it's just so crazy that it still occurs and still happens, but it's constant. But another one that we've seen, and this is something I'll probably talk about more as we go through the show, is in persistence, the basic stuff like modifying the registry run key, right? This was something that was constant. There was a couple other persistence things with like service creations and things like that, that they were in such a large part of the data set that it really draws to that idea that we've talked about. And it was almost like we talked about it because we had that momentum through all the research we've done and then what we do on our daily. But it was cool to see the data that actually reflected that, right? So that idea of you get to hunt for one kind of behavior and cover down on many adversaries, like it was perfectly defined in this space, right? And persistence is a great area for this because, man, so many people leverage that similar technique. So many adversaries across the board, so many different malwares had it as part of their payload delivered, part of their execution. But you know, it's just a thing that I thought was really interesting. We had a couple other finds in this area that we'll talk about later, but I did want to bring up the persistence piece before we move on.
Yeah, no, the kind of piggyback off that, I think one of the things that kind of came up routinely is every once in a while we came across a really good source of like a really complex attack, right? It'd be like, oh wow, they got in and then they had this really disjoint thing. They used techniques I didn't know if we could even like identify to like carry on their execution and manipulate specific things. And then like after this huge chain of things to kind of obfuscate their activities, then they drop the register run key like towards the end to persist what they just did, right? And it was just like I always like blew my mind. I was like, man, like they were like had so much sophistication, and then that was the one thing because they needed that hook or needed that persistence. And usually it wasn't the only method of persistence. It was like that plus a couple other things, right? But it was just like knowing that just looking for that, even someone like the advanced adversaries really want that trusted, tried and true persistence mechanism. And they would drop that. And it was always just kind of cracked me up. I'm like, if it weren't for that, I don't know if I'd be able to find you as successfully. But just because of that, it's like kind of almost a good go-to when you have the time and want to dig through some data.
Which is wild because you think from like a vendor side or like operating system side, not us, but like if you look at this complex attack, you're like, man, it was a sophisticated APT, blah, blah, exactly like you said. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, they use this very common technique in the middle of it all. And that's how they persist in your environment. Wouldn't you start asking questions like, why? Why is this the same?
Well, maybe we should talk about it loud enough.
Very legitimate purpose, but at the same time, stop.
Yeah, like it's funny. I would actually, if I was setting up and orchestrating an attack, I would almost tell the people developing, don't use these things, right? Just off the top of my head, because I'd be like, these are too obvious, you know. But yeah.
Start a folder, schedule tasks, a registry run key.
But let me just resurface this just in case, you know, any of the bad guys are listening. You guys are doing great. Keep doing that thing. I think it works. Obviously it works all the time. Stay with it because it's helpful. But no, I mean, if we shout about this stuff loud enough, I mean, I'm a bit of a dreamer in this idea, but if we professionals keep talking about this stuff and keep putting this data together, what we're seeing, you know, maybe it'll help encourage some of the tools to kind of have this ready, like make sure that this is a mainstay. It's attractive because these things are constant. They're so constant. And
your guys' name is going to show us some of the strings of some malware someday.
I know.
Specifically in the persistence mechanism part.
I was going to say the single character stuff. I remember we harped on that for so long and then we didn't see it for a little while. I'm like, oh my gosh, like someone must be listening to us. And then it came right back. Like it would just have like a small break where, yeah. So even that kind of stuff is crazy.
Well, I hope we keep enough of an eye to the work here, Scott, for long enough. And I'm gonna be honest. I don't want to see anyone get attacked. But if somebody decides to like single character their whole payload around your name, just one letter of your name the whole way, just to say, "I heard you, buddy. I heard you."
I kind of take that as like a little pride mark.
Oh yeah. Okay, let's kick over to techniques. Let's start talking about some more depth here. So, you know, some of the stuff that I found initially that was very interesting, and we identified through those 76 articles, there were 323 different techniques used with a total of 791 techniques leveraged, right? So quite a spread there, right? But one of the key points around that though is the majority of them were one-off behaviors, one-off techniques. The top 15 to 20 were the majority of that 791 were, specifically the top 10 that you're seeing here. So we've seen a lot of these specific ones, and just to, you know, again, I'm going to harp on it every chance I get with the data points because I just think it's so valuable, especially for any of the hunters out here listening. If you ever find yourself in a lull or not sure which thing to focus on, and you don't have a reactive item on your desk, looking at those hunt one, hunt all type of behaviors, go back through them, repeat them. They're so good. They cover down on so much, and you see it right here. Like you can see The fourth highest one is the one we're talking about for persistence, right? There's other repeat ones in there as well, but yeah. So just to kind of like lay it out for you guys, I'm curious what you guys thought from the technique side of the house.
Yeah, I think the big thing that's interesting here is obviously discovery was kind of low, but here it's the one that's like probably the system information discovery, pretty consistent across all those. Sometimes with techniques, the way they group them, and we've talked about this before, where even if you do like that MITRE mapping coverage of saying like I cover on this technique, it doesn't really mean you actually cover on every way that technique is facilitated, because sometimes it's kind of general. Like when you look at the exfiltration over C2 channel, that's being really like one of the top things there. Granted, we know that happened in so many different ways, right? Um, as far as how they're using the C2 channel, how they're communicating, what that looks like. So, I think that's always kind of an interesting point, is sometimes this data can be really helpful to help you, like, where should we be spending time based on the telemetry you have? And that's how I would look at this as more of a strategic thing. Like, hey, what kind of visibility do we have in the C2 channel? Do we have something that's like a, proxy in the middle so we can see maybe decrypted traffic in general? Or do we have PCAP to try to do some PCAP analysis? If you don't, then even mid exfiltration over C2 channel is pretty high. Maybe that's not where you want to put your efforts, right? But if you have really good host-based telemetry, looking at that system information discovery, or if you have really good email telemetry, maybe looking for like the spear phishing attachments or things associated with that. Like that's how I kind of digest some of this, because there are kind of like big groups, even though they're considered a single tactic or technique, sorry. But yeah, that's kind of my first take when I was looking at this data.
So I guess my overall hunting tip regarding this, and again, it doesn't involve a lot of like in-depth telemetry, but something that is, I'll say a quick win, but it's a lot more work than me just saying it. But if you are hunting for like exfiltration over C2, one thing that is paramount, baselining your environment. Really baselining your environment will help with every tactic or technique that you're looking for in the long run. So again, if you're looking for exfiltration, find out what ports, IP ranges, legitimate traffic's talking to. Get all those, bundle them up, and say, okay, not this. And then you might be able to start seeing things. Granted, not everything you find is going to be malicious or suspicious, but at the same time, it might provide insight into how things are operating in your environment that might be outside the norm for whatever reason. Um, I always go back to that, Windows 98 or XP box that just can't die because some engineer 30 years ago programmed something that is running still, right? You always have that legacy stuff. But at the same time, like if you know about it and you understand how it operates, understanding how it, what's outside the norm will definitely help. And that goes for living upland binaries, C2, I mean, you name it, right?
Yeah. So, something that I think is interesting. So, right there in the middle, you see the command and scripting interpreter for PowerShell. And obviously, we see a lot of PowerShell activity in a lot of the reports we're seeing. But I think the context around what we were seeing is kind of a more important piece there. And why I say that is I call it multi-stage native script execution. And what that really means is every time we saw these attacks, and a lot of times you saw them early too, because it was all about the execution transition, where you would see where you have either WScript or MSHTA or command prompt and then PowerShell, but they're all like, what is executing what, right? Out of those 4 different executables, it is always incredibly weird when there's this chain of executions for these script interpreters to basically be linking together. So PowerShell showed up a lot, but a lot of times it might be command prompt kicking off PowerShell or WScript kicking off PowerShell. That in itself is kind of more suspicious than just PowerShell being run, right? And then some of the activities we saw with a lot of the PowerShell usage, I mean, frankly, I thought it was still kind of crazy that PowerShell was a big driver for how things were being downloaded, right? For like that tool ingress component. And the only thing that we really, from memory now, I'm calling on, that was very different was how they tried to obfuscate calling that same command. So it's like the same method. And that kind of drives to, how do you do your logging? That's the one thing that's really powerful about the PowerShell based logging is even if there's obfuscation happening for how they want to break up commands and do things, um, if you have that PowerShell logging enabled, it deobfuscates all that before execution. That's what it's going to show in that log. So then it's really easy to look for those specific commandlets used to download files and download and execute things from PowerShell because it's just native in that log. You don't have to have this attack this problem 10 different ways anymore just by having the right log source. So just knowing that PowerShell is, 50% prevalent from what we kind of see here roughly, it's good to understand that context of how we were seeing PowerShell than just PowerShell natively,
Yeah, and the obfuscated file size, right? So that's the third highest technique we've seen. It was unbelievably high percentage to PowerShell encoded commands. I mean, we've seen them everywhere. We've seen them leveraged in the click fix style attacks. We've seen them leveraged in things from like Cold Driver, where they were locking in encoded commands in the registry key edits. That PowerShell encoded command is another one of those. It is used so often, and there's a bunch of different ways. Scott, like you alluded to the different telemetry that'll actually like break apart that base 64 encoded command. There's also ways that you can use in most tools, actually, a lot of tools that are out there now, your EDRs, your SIMs, etc. Basic regex that can track that as long as you're pulling that command line telemetry or the PowerShell script block logging, right? You can strip apart some of the encoded commands to find those things. You can find the encoded command is what I'm getting at. And it's another one that's just prevalent across the board. It's used so often. There was one thing you mentioned, Scott, that I remember at least two or three, and I should have pointed these because it's a good point that you made about leveraging PowerShell to download or pull payloads. We've seen a lot where people were executing curl in PowerShell, which is interesting to me because I always wondered because you weren't executing curl true, but curl in PowerShell just does the invoke web request. And please, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's exactly how it works. But you would see literally that.
It depends on. So there is, in some, I think the newer Windows, like Windows 11 and some things, they actually have curl binary that it can call on. But in past, when curl binary is in there, it actually is an alias, like you said, to the invoke.
To the invoke, right? And I wonder if like the attackers knew that and they would just use it as a way to try to maybe change the game, or they were just using something that was familiar to them. I'm not sure, but we did see that a few times too.
Yeah.
So I don't know who's going to listen to this, but you can threat hunt from a large range of sizes of organizations. It can go from mom and pop shop, if that's something that's going on, small, medium businesses, all the way to corporations. It can be done successfully with, and I know this is like outside of scope and not what we're talking about, so I'll be quick about it, and I apologize. But if we're talking about game changers, if you want to look for these tactics and hunt efficiently, if you don't have an EDR or a SIM, or you have a SIM but it's small or whatever the case, by enabling PowerShell script log logging, installing Sysmon in your environment, and having native Windows logging on your machines, that's a game changer. That will give you enough telemetry and information that you can successfully start hunting. Systemon's basically EDR for Windows machines. PowerShell script logging, like Polly was talking about, it provides a ton of information. And oh, by the way, if the attackers are using PowerShell commandlets, those won't show up in normal or a native logging or Sysmon logs unless they're chained in the command line arguments. But if they go into PowerShell and say get item blah blah blah, you won't see that in the event log. So that's why it's very important to have that PowerShell script log logging involved, because that will give you insight into PowerShell. And PowerShell being a very useful living off lamb binary and a very powerful one, it's going to get abused more and more. So if you have 3 takeaways from this, like on how to increase or improve your security posture, get those 3 things going, collect all the data, and then get after it.
I want to add to that, Lee, because that's a great point. So if there are anybody that's listening from like the mom and pop side of the house, Lee just gave really good meat and potatoes on how to secure your environment with in a smaller environment with the tool set you already have. Another thing you can add to that is enable all those on your stuff. Use Windows forwarding to a separate box, and then you can enhance the log collection there and come up with like really creative scripts to actually dig through it. And that doesn't scale to enterprise, of course, right? Like I actually know that for sure because I've done a lot with that in the past. It doesn't scale great, but in smaller shops, it works really well. I mean, you could really kind of get to it. So if you feel like you're, hunting's too far out in your purview, it's really not. It's really not. You can do some things that can get you to that data really fast and help you protect your environment.
And if you want to learn how not to do it, I'm sure if you go back to our earlier episodes, you'll find some stories of how not to do it.
We have a few of those. I think all of us do.
It's part of being in the field for too long.
Learned, right?
Yeah, the one thing that I thought was surprising that it didn't show up in the top 10, because I feel like when it did show up in the reporting, they were really like substantial attacks. Like I would say one of the better style of attacks, and that was the DLL sideloading. Because I feel like DLL sideloading, every time it seemed to come up, it wasn't just oh, there's this DLL sideloading. Like the reports were usually pretty in depth, and they usually hit some pretty big targets when it was actually occurring, because DLL sideloading is a lot harder in some aspects for EDRs, I think, to go after or auto detect or report on. Part of the reason is because if people aren't familiar with DLL sideloading and how it's being leveraged, is attackers just find executables. Doesn't matter even how old they are, but they're executables that when they were built are vulnerable to, basically they'll load whatever DLL they're supposed to load to support the application, and just look for anything named that in the directory where it's being run from. And so what attackers, when they find those executables, all they do is they build their DLL and name it to match whatever that legitimate executable is looking for. And so it'll load that instead. And then basically it's running their payload, and it's a lot harder for things sometimes to be analyzed when they're loaded that way. But from a threat hunting perspective, especially when you know you're being attacked this way, they're not usually attacking an executable you have, right? They're usually bringing that executable into your environment and then leveraging it. So you usually, if you can see file creation activity, I know Lee mentioned sysmon earlier. You can configure sysmon to look for things with certain extensions, so executables, EXEs, DLLs. That's a great way, just using time-based telemetry, where if you see DLLs being written and executables being written to the same directory, and especially if it's a weird directory like your downloads, temp, just see whatever, it's a good indication that you should be paying attention to DLL sideloading, because some of the adversaries do a pretty good job with finding those exploitable, legit executables to kind of initiate their attack. And it's kind of interesting too. We mentioned the PowerShell downloading. I remember a lot where they would have some mechanism where they'd use PowerShell to download some zip or something that had that all combined, untar, zip that, and then you still have the same thing, the creation of the EXE and the DLL for that DLL sideloading technique. So being able to group those file creations together is a pretty powerful method for looking for something that's kind of an advanced technique in a lot of ways.
Because like it takes a lot of research to figure out the order that executable's looking for the DLL. So I mean that would be a little more advanced, but no, nailed it.
Yeah. So kind of looking, in the same theme when we're kind of talking about techniques again, as I touched on previously, probably will 2 or 3 more times. I just want to beat it all the way home. I just think it's so valuable to all of us hunters, all of us defenders. The hunt once, hunt many. So just some kind of stats that we pulled from this data. So when we talked about the the auto run registry modification, right? So that's just the one that stood out the absolute most. We covered if you were to hunt for that behavior throughout the course of the year, you would have actually covered down on more than 40 separate actors / malware that was used. And that's just from the data set that we had, that we went through. I'm certain that it was higher than that. And I think we know that for sure because we understand the stuff that we weren't reported on and we're working on a day-to-day. This one is used by so many different adversaries, different malwares. But there was a couple other ones there. The file obfuscation, right? PowerShell encoded commands was the biggest one, but super prevalent. Again, you see them just in that small data set. if you were to hunt for that specific activity, you're covering down on 24 different actors, 32 different malware. And then the system discovery one, right? So the system discovery one is interesting because Scott, you had mentioned it. I think it was you that mentioned it. Maybe it was Lee. A little earlier in the show, we were talking about like this was common, and it didn't score as high when you kind of looked at the discovery from the tactics spot based on the way the data was, kind of put together, like just the way it tracked. But when we seen discovery, it was in abundance. So we'd see it constantly. We'd see different methods of discovery. It didn't matter if it was Windows, Linux. It was almost always that there was some level of discovery inside. Most of the time, what we see is a lot of just environmental or system gathering, right? So you'd see Atch commands running, the things like, running who am I's, doing NS lookups, doing a bunch of stuff. We'd see stuff on the PowerShell side, running all the commandlets in like the AD module, right? To get AD user, get AD domain, trying to just scrape all that data together. Similar things on the Linux side of the house. It was constant. And if you consider that these are constant pieces, right? Put them all together. When you're looking at hunting, you're looking at trying to prove what you're covering down on. Maybe you have to consider new ways to show ROI for your efforts. There's so many things to grab from this area. And I thought it was really important to point out. So I'll let you guys expand.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing I would cover there is, I mean, this is why I think behaviors are so important, because once you figure out to hunt for a specific behavior in your environment, and you kind of get it tuned to your environment as well, there is so much effective space to cover down on a lot with less, right? In some ways, and the thing, we constantly get the question when we say, well, what's the difference between like threat hunting or detection engineering or detections, like that whole gambit of things. And really what it comes down to, like, for instance, if you're saying you want to look for system information discovery, and you can go off of a hunt that you've seen, or you build one yourself, the big thing there is, yeah, if you can get that thing tuned where you don't really have much noise and you make it into a detection, that's great. But discovery is a good example where there's a lot of things that happen in an environment that might be using a lot of those bins or lull bins for just, operational things. Admins have scripts that run certain things or whatever it may be, and you can't kind of exclude a lot of the noise. That's why it just becomes that recurring hunt, because you know what's already going to be in the data, you know what to expect. It's something that you know that if you put eyes on it, based on how you built it and how you have the data output from that, you can easily identify, hey, this is something we should dig into further, and pivoting on that just becomes so much easier and effective. But yeah, identifying, I think that what's great about this is it's really about identifying behaviors that are shared, because it shows kind of like your overall effectiveness when you can group what it covers down on, like you're showing right now.
Yeah, and there's there's a couple other small points here too to think about, and we'll talk about this a little more as we go on. This kind of leads into not only the going after behaviors versus the old traditional IOC type stuff, but it also brings in, like, when you think system discovery, you can start considering the correlation and aggregation piece of it, because almost always we've seen these ran in batches within scripts or payloads that would run in a small window. They weren't really hiding themselves, right?
Yeah.
So you'd see all these discovery commands happening on a single host by a single account. And if you start considering that versus just a one-off match, okay, I've seen discovery, right? You're going to see basic stuff in your environment. You're going to see the one-offs, right? Those are the things you have to work around. But if you start considering that correlation and aggregation piece, I've seen 3 of these on the same system in X amount of time in a 90-second window or something, whatever. There's a lot of room to wiggle and work there. You're gonna broaden your horizons to what you're gonna see, and you're gonna shrink down the false positives and the overhaul that you have to do with the logs that you're gonna find. And it's definitely an important note. The other thing too, I think, that comes out of this hunt for the behaviors, and you cover down on so many, a lot of times I think we as hunters get kind of caught up in the we want to attribute this to something because somebody from upper management's come down and said, hey, I need you to tell me where we're at with these guys. Tell me where we're at with this report. Or maybe there's this really new hot malware that's out there, a new ransomware strain or something that everyone's talking about. So you're kind of going after it. You want to make sure that you're covering your environment for the whole thing. So you're trying to apply that attribution. And that's not a bad thing. But when you consider stuff like this, when you're kind of crossing all of these territories, you can kind of break away from some of that attribution need with confidence. You know what I'm saying? You guys get what I'm getting at here? I just think those are 2 points. Go ahead, Lee.
Take it out. I always like to say hunters find the artifacts. We're going to hand it over to CTI and let them do the attribution. Like, let them play that game. Because at the end of the day, if I find persistence and then I find the execution, then I find the initial access, I don't care who did it. My job is to report to the IR team and say, hey, here's all my findings. We need to act on this, so-and-so. So pass that report to IR, maybe even, defer. Send it over to CTI. Be like, look, this is what we found. Let them dig into it. Let them do the resourcing and look for the other artifacts that we find. And like you were talking about, like the latest and greatest, like and this goes back to Pulley's point again with the registry key or auto run registry key modification. Like, it's great to look for the latest and greatest and the coolest, like the cool guy techniques. But if you master the basics and nail down those low hanging fruit, like you're at the end of the day, it normally one of those play a part, and you're going to be able to find malicious or suspicious activity like a much sooner than if you're just waiting for that one technique that was used by this APT in this one campaign 3 years ago. Whereas these common behaviors have a shelf life of until the actor or until this stops working, we're going to keep using it. And that's the shelf life versus IOC, a day, an hour, if so, or if these, the hot shot behaviors associated with CVEs that are going to get patched and might not work anymore. Get those PowerShell encoded commands, discovery, auto run, nail those down, and it's going to be a lot easier.
No, I think a good point, kind of tailing on the point you made earlier, Lee, about like knowing your environment, as far as what tool sets you use and the kind of the things we're talking about here with grouping is knowing how to do kind of like, I would call it gating in your tool sets. And what that means is like, how do you say, this happens more than X number of times or less than X number of times, or this is rare versus this is common, based on, seeing how all that works. I think that's an effective way to understand how to use your tools more effective for threat hunting, especially if we're looking for generalized behaviors. And also it's a good way to kind of walk your way through the data. Like sometimes you can set a gate for like, I want to look at anything that's less than this or greater than this number of times occurring and whatever, or group it by this. And you can say, I don't really like those results. Well, you can move that gate left and right, right? You can kind of like have a sliding scale a little bit and walk that hunt into a range where now you know how to make good decisions on maybe what to exclude or what do you target or whatever that is. And I think that's what's really nice about looking at behaviors, because behaviors will always be there. Like we've proven here, right? They overlap so much that they exist. It's just, how does that behavior identify itself in your environment? And that's the thing that changes, is the environments where they run in are very different. So you can't just say, I'm going to download this detection tool and it's going to work every time, right? Because every environment is so different. And that's how you kind of tune threat hunting to hopefully build better detections as well in an environment.
Absolutely. All right. Let's kick it over to kind of a group theme, right? So let's talk about the threat actors, malware, and themes. So there's, I kind of put this all in one category because I think there's overlap. I also think that there's an abundance here, but we could also get lost in the sauce if we focus on them for too long. So trying to group them all and just kind of go through a general discussion here, right? Some things you're going to see come up against the stuff we talked about earlier. Lull bins, crazy, crazy focus. So, a lot of the stuff we're giving might seem simple or tried and true, but it's okay that it's simple and tried and true because it works and it's stuff that we can consider. But yeah, we've seen a lot of stuff this year from different things. We were constantly bombarded, as is usually, at least I feel confident saying this, guys. Every year, the hot topics, the new ransomware, the new kid on the block, or the one that's had the biggest impact or the biggest, kind of exposure. Those attacks are usually covered in abundance, right? And we think that like we're focusing on this, and a lot of times I think, and I've experienced this in batches in my past as a practitioner in different environments, getting too focused on those big ones and not thinking, at least thinking about what else is happening, right? So we've seen all kinds of stuff this year. You had your big supply chain attacks, you know, your shy elude stuff. The MPM stuff I thought was fascinating because it actually lended to new behaviors that tied into. Yeah, and it's we could see kind of a trend of the leverage of behaviors that were expanded on from these kinds of attacks. Like we've seen techniques leveraged against the NPM area for persistence mechanisms, for obfuscation, for payload delivery, because people learned based on that one attack, at least this is my assessment, that these functions work really well and they're not covered or looked for very much. So other people started taking this, other adversaries, other malware started using these NPM pieces. A lot of the rants. Oh, go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
Yeah, on the NPM piece in general, I thought what was really interesting tie-in, because AI was always a topic of conversation, was the few different lead-ins that we saw that led to packages like NPM, PyPy, and so forth, where you can see how devs are using AI, and AI is suggesting repos and libraries that actually don't exist, and how adversaries are learning either because they're using the tools the same way, and they're actually creating these repos that are then being used and pulled down. And so that's kind of facilitating some of the supply chain attack. Obviously, they're doing some like typo squatting and stuff like that to try to like be adjacent to legitimate packages to hopefully get grabbed that way. But there were instances where uh, repos were legitimately created for malicious purpose, driven by how AI suggested what libraries you should use before they even existed. So I thought that was an interesting AI tie-in to the whole supply chain piece.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And then we've seen, kind of, which I think, and we'll kind of cover down this on the back end of the takeaway stuff, but the supply chain attack and the way that it was approached, especially in the last half of last year, we're already seeing extensions of that continuance right away this year, right? And I think it was either last week or the week before in our weekly shows, we were talking about the N8N nightmare stuff, right?
Yeah.
And them leveraging that. The way that was leveraged was using some of the similar NPM approaches to how to deploy the stuff, but they were capturing these packages in a tool set that offered these community nodes, and they were doing it in a really creative way, right? So they were looking to see what things weren't there. Like when you talk about the typo squatting, this was like just a little bit past that, where they were like, okay, well, what items are available for the tool that would be common for users, and what community nodes are actually there for that? So they would swallow up those nodes and those naming conventions to make them look legitimate, and then have this supply chain approach of package. They're using a lot of the same techniques with the NPM side, in the JavaScript library, in the whole thing. And it was we're already seeing that, and I expect to see it go throughout this year because it's creative and it works really well, and it has so much potential impact, which is crazy and a little scary.
I was kind of wondering if this was kind of like the after effects of what adversaries learned from the Log4j stuff. Because like when they start targeting like developers and realize that if they just get something in, like the amount of like access and disruption, being able to take advantage of Log4j where people didn't even know where it existed. And that was like the first challenge, from an adversary perspective, especially if you're looking for a really effective long-term attack, knowing how effective that could be, and then looking at this as an avenue to get there. I wonder if there was any kind of influence or tie in there.
So I think another influence, and I may be wrong. Yeah, if I am, please let me know. But let me ask you a couple questions and walk us in here. So what is on the top two CIS security controls that a lot of organizations struggle with? What's the one in
know like all the devices and stuff, and then know all the software and stuff, right?
hardware and software?
Software.
So
yeah.
How many organizations do you think could go and find the software they're using? And on top of that, like, do you need to know which packages are being used, correct? So how deep does that inventory go? So hopefully, if anything, these attacks really made it, brought that to attention to say it's, at one point it's okay to know what software you have, but sometimes you got to dive a little deeper.
Yeah.
Especially if you are crafting things in-house, that maybe that's something you now start taking advantage of or keeping an eye on. Not that organizations aren't already, but maybe that should drive that conversation a little more.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
one avenue there is really, at least a takeaway from me, and this is a very basic takeaway, but how once you kind of know your environment, you know what's happening in your environment, you'll prioritize focus left, like depending on things you see. Like soft example, right? If I'm in an environment and I have X amount of domain admins, I'm going to put a little bit of higher prioritization around them, whether it be their accounts, their machines, etc. For me, this new pattern and trend going towards the developers, might have been a bit of an oversight before, because people might have considered that developers are working inside of a controlled like space, a dev space, so whatever you may call it, and might not have been putting in much attention on their developer side. To me, this screams, up your consideration for watching those. Maybe look at some creative ways to apply criticality to stuff around those folks in their environment, because you know that they're working in these spaces, and you now know that there's a higher potential for impact or access from there.
Yeah, I think I'd even mentioned on previous episodes, but one of the ways I like to use LLMs, especially since I do like a lot of like tinkering, right, with different code and stuff. If there's code or something I want to use from GitHub, or I want to pull something down, sometimes if you have access to the source, it's really good to say, drop that source code in an LLM like ChatGPT or so forth, and say, hey, is there anything that looks suspicious, or anything that like stands out that I should like dig into further, to get a quick like highlight on, if I don't know how to read everything, or I don't want to read every single line, where should I focus my attention, just to give myself that sense of security, like I'm at least aware of how this is supposed to work and what communications this is creating, all that kind of stuff. So it's a great, I think, easy button for kind of giving yourself a double check on trying to use for just testing or exploration purposes.
For sure. So, what were your guys' opinions? Because I know these ones tended to be more of the louder ones that we've seen throughout the year, but all the various ransomware as a service type models, these guys are still prevalent. Like, we still hear about them, we're still chasing them. They're always on the threat watch. What were your guys' opinions on how that looks throughout the course of the year?
I mean, the same volume and noise, same effectiveness. I think the biggest thing that's changed a lot that I've seen isn't so much how they necessarily operated in a lot of ways. It's more how the social engineering aspect worked. And there was a bigger emphasis, and we saw this with info stealers, right? Where it wasn't so much about the initial compromise by landing a payload and kind of walking it that way. Because we saw a lot of the, get your hooks in and then drop in some of the remote admin tools, right, for access. We started to see, since the info stealers were growing in general, where it was more about already having credentials that worked and taking advantage from that standpoint. So kind of like the avenue of approach changed a little bit. And obviously, I think towards the end of the year, and even some beginning of this year, I think that's why you started to see more cloud affected um, things associated with some ransomware activity or groups, or at least with stealing data, just because of the info stealer and credential access, since that's how that kind of is governed and controlled.
From the little research that I've done, when it comes to the ransomware, I mean, I'll say time and time again, getting the general feel is that they work better together than most organizations do. That their techniques are going to change. They're going to find out what works, and everyone's going to start using it. So, I mean, when it comes to, again, focusing on ransomware, if that is one of your focuses, look at the sharing behaviors, see what's working. Again, like Polly mentioned, even if it is super complex, there's probably some things that each group is doing the same thing, because, again, it keeps working. So if you're going to prioritize anything, go, again, focus on the basics, focus on the share, and drive that way, and see what else you can find.
Yeah.
And I don't want to, my statement that's going to follow has nothing to do with knocking anybody's priority or focus, right? Because I am not the key master of everyone's environment. Everyone's environment's differently. But in my opinion, I think this is one of the areas where I think attribution is less important. And I may go out on a hill and stand on myself here, but I think
They'll tell you if they hit you, right?
Yeah. And Yeah, and so much of what's done in these spaces has so much. This one has more overlap than I think any, as far as like the behaviors that we see, and making sure that you're protecting yourself, especially from the ransomware side. If you consider those basic behaviors and really kind of, put the attribution piece down a bit, um, these guys go after everybody. There's no, real focus. They hit every industry. They're targeting whoever they can get. They want to go after big players. They'll hit small players. It doesn't matter. So attribution in this space, I think, is a lot less valuable. So, just a note from my perspective.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's not up here that we did hear a lot of chatter about in general was all the click fix, file fix, every type of fix or whatever. And there was always really creative ways in which that was kind of being leveraged. But the crazy thing is it always kind of had the same like flavor of telemetry where you've got Explorer kicking off a process with command line arguments and code following almost every time. And so it was interesting how novel that was. I know when it first came out, we were still baffled that people fell for it.
Still am.
But
I still am.
right, I would say the best one we saw was the one that made it look like you got a blue screen and then fixed it. That was probably the best because people actually thought something happened they had to respond to versus hey, just do this, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting how the social aspect has changed in that, but the mechanism in which people fall for it and what it looks like from a telemetry side, it wasn't super advanced. And it should be fairly rare for how they're actually running things and what it looks like from the command line perspective. So there was that. Now the other thing on here, which I think is interesting, the APT groups, and we had that list there, and Lewis mentioned APT 33, which makes sense only because there's a lot of news in about Iran in general, right? So people were kind of thinking about freaking out about that and what that means. But the unique thing with the APT reporting that we looked at, this was really good examples where the attacks were very, very unique. Some of the reporting that we saw with APTs, but there was always that few nuggets where how they used PowerShell and that script interpreting type thing, or the persistence pieces. Persistence and execution for APTs, I think, are the best ways to look at seeing some of their activity. The only challenge with some of the attacks we saw with APTs in 2025 was the window in which you would actually identify them is early in the attack, but it seemed like a lot of the payloads and how they behaved after the fact was where they were kind of quiet. So the one thing that's good is to be hunting proactively and routinely, reproduce that hunt so that you can kind of like check back, because if you don't look in that window where they're actually doing the things that were detectable, much, much harder to detect down the road, right? So that's why having that iterative, constantly looking for these types of common behaviors is really important, especially with some of the advanced attacks that we saw.
So what about and don't get me wrong, click fix is very prevalent right now. What do you think about file fix? That little spin off.
Yeah, I mean, I know like if you type in like for instance CMD or whatever into the file explorer bar, it'll open up command prompt in that directory. Like that's where it'll open it from. So there's always like shortcuts Windows is built in. So I'm not surprised that that eventually got leveraged. But what's interesting is I think the telemetry still looks the same because it's still Explorer initiating things. Um, but it's interesting because you think about security awareness training. You're going to tell people, hey, don't do this. And they're like, well, I didn't do that. This is something different, right? So it's like almost sidestepping the human defense element there a little bit.
I feel like this is the new flavor of like scareware, but it's like being helpful. Like, cause back in the day, it'll pop up like your computer, the FBI, we've seized it, pay us 100.
Oh, this number.
Right. Yeah. But now it's like with all that cybersecurity training and like cybersecurity awareness and stuff, people like are a little more onto it. So when this pops up, they're like, oh God, like, wait, there's something I can do about it. Two, I'm helping the organization because I'm not eating up a help desk ticket. I'm not, pulling help. Let's go away. I can do this. This is basic task. And it's not like urgent or like nothing's calling out directly saying you should be scared. It's just like, hey, here it is.
Yeah.
We ran into a problem, but follow these instructions and you'll be okay.
All the training for however long we've been going through it is don't click this link, don't call this phone number, right? And now they're like, you don't have to do either one of them. You can fix this yourself, right? The psychology of it is
Yeah.
will forever remain fascinating to me because it's like it's so interesting that this works so well to me.
But think about it, like I'm not trying to make assumptions here, but how many people outside IT know what command shell is or PowerShell? Or, like no one, like how many people are tracking living off the land binary? But if, again, trying to be helpful to their organization and, be like, oh, yeah, whatever PowerShell is, I'll open it up and run this. Good, help out. Like that gives you that warm and fuzzy. I did something and not the scared. But I think you're right. It's wild.
Yeah, that's a good angle though, Lee.
It's empowering people.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. Okay, just we don't have to go too far in this because we talked about a lot, but I do think it's worth mentioning because it is a growing thing, and I honestly think as we go into the next year, we're going to see a bit of a divide on this topic, right? I think there's a lot of people that are going to be out here talking about AI. Like there's the AI side when it comes to adversary and malware use. We have our opinions and it's not absolute and everyone's going to have their opinions, but I think it's worth at least talking about because it is going to heavily trend into this year. I think it's going to be talked about more, and I anticipate a big divide there between probably the folks like us, the way we think about what's going to happen, and then other people that are, maybe trying to sell a new capability or think about other things, right? What are your guys' opinions on the use of AI going forward from actors and in malware and in general?
I mean, my sense is, as we've seen, like all the AI tools are gradually getting better. So I feel like actors using them because they are, they're going to gradually get better at using them and they'll get the benefits from using them. So it's not really like a race so much as it is as long as we're doing the same thing as defenders. It's just kind of an equal playing field. It really comes down to what problems are you trying to solve and what priorities do you have. If you're going to kind of take the win on that one, because if you prioritize the wrong thing and you're using the same tools, it's not going to be beneficial, right? So I really think that's how I would divide it up. Is it's not going to be a huge game changer unless people are trying to solve the wrong problems. Which, if with marketing and everything else that happens around this space with AI, right? Very easy, very easy for people to just dump AI into things, or we use AI this way, and they're not solving the right problems, and then now this gap is created, right? Because when we're buying products with AI, adversaries, they're not buying products, they're building. So they have their priorities set and they're working towards a solution. We're just hoping someone else solves it for us and giving us technology, right? So sometimes that, I think, could potentially create the problem.
Good point. Okay, so kind of move forward. I thought this one was interesting too. So this kind of comparison, I was looking at the data that we reported versus the focus the hunters were having on the side that we could see or relate data to. Um, it's not that it necessarily speaks to anybody doing anything wrong. So I just want to be very clear on that. But I do think the data does help lend to considering different priorities, considering different approaches. There were a couple things that I took away from this data. One being something we had already talked about, where there was more of a focus on attribution versus the common overlaps. I thought this spoke to that pretty well. But yeah, I want to know what you guys thought about this data point, because I thought this one was the most interesting to me out of all of them.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the level of focus on privilege escalation, where a lot of people seem to focus a lot of their hunting efforts on that. But from a lot of the reporting we saw, there wasn't a lot of emphasis, and even in the reporting, on privilege escalation. Because a lot of the activities were just leveraging whatever access they already had to do most of the things they needed to do. So that part was interesting. Obviously, I think when you're in an environment, the big tipping point for like how bad something gets is when someone can get to like, a domain admin credential or some service-based credential or whatever that looks like. Um, because that's when the impact will be way worse. So that might be why there's so much emphasis on that. Um, but I feel like there's a multitude of ways, and it's sometimes environment specific for people to escalate because depending on like what software you're running, what services are already running, what you potentially could take advantage of. Um, that might change how someone to escalate in your environment. So it could be kind of a moving target or a difficult target to research on versus some of the other things that could lead you to that. I always like to see privileged escalation as the context for how I know this is an attack based on the data I'm seeing, then starting with that, if that makes sense. Because it is more of a confirmation for me than it is because if I see something that looks like privileged escalation and then I can't understand what's going on around it, it's kind of hard to like even communicate what to do following that other than disable something, right? Or change the password.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. And I mean, I like looking at the rest. Like, I like that they're well covered. But that privilege escalation is an interesting one. That the hunt percentage is up, but and I guess really it comes with like correlation. I guess correlation might be your best. Like this process was running here, but all of a sudden it was bumped to system, or and because I mean, even with system, I'm thinking about the telemetry that deals with like process injection is tough. Then again, looking at what processes should be spawned from that, parent process could be something, but at the same time, if you're specifically looking for just privilege escalation, that might be a hard hunt. But I like exfiltration and collection, and what credential access are all the way up. That's neat.
I was going to say there could be a misleading point in the data where sometimes creating scheduled tasks and things looks like persistence and usually gets grouped as persistence, but it could be actually tied towards privilege escalation, depending on how it's leveraged, right? And that's what I think is interesting about some of the techniques we see, depending on how you want to assign MITRE and how the reporting. Sometimes we read reporting and they give it their traditional MITRE tagging, but in reality, if you actually like break down the attack, they're using that traditional MITRE technique for persistence, but it's not really being leveraged in this way for that. It's more of an escalation or something else, right?
Yeah, and I hope just kind of discussing it, maybe even the data point, even though we're not going heavily into it, just considering like really thinking about the proactive versus reactive types when you're considering hunting. Considering what we talked about today, the one hunt for many, understanding that the overlap and reuse of common behaviors, that keeps you more to the proactive side. Reactive is more the hot and new, the heavy, the stuff that's in the news, the things that you're being handed down that everyone's concerned about. There is a balance to be had between both. Going either direction is not wrong, but something to consider to help you gain more coverage and accomplish more with less, if you will. Okay, so we do have some questions from folks, so I want to make sure we can get to those. But I just want to kind of talk about, and see if you guys had anything to add. I won't go through all of the takeaways we had here, but there were a couple from my side that I thought were just important. And again, they're going to be a little bit of rehash. Really, again, looking at those overlap behaviors, I just, the data screamed this, and it was surprising to me how much it screamed it. So it's going to be a new hill I think I personally am going to die on. The low bin stuff, we mentioned that a few times, really kind of, looking at that as a default threat model when you're considering what to hunt for and what to consider. I don't think that could be more true, ever be more true than it is today. And then, one of the other ones too is really focusing on those techniques that offer a greater long-term defense return, right? So the novel stuff is so cool sometimes, right? And we get caught in it. But like Scott had mentioned before, really really get good at those common behaviors. Be a masterclass at those, and you're going to go a long way. And it's even going to help you, really kind of understand the novel stuff even more, I think, personally, because it helps me. But that's just a couple I had from this year and what I expect going forward. Go ahead, you
I
guys.
mean, I was just going to echo a lot of what you said, but like, if I were to say, the big takeaway from everything I saw in 2025, and I'm kind of curious as I track going into 2026, that multi-stage native script execution, it seems to like just scream so loud. And what's crazy is it sometimes you can almost have a high confidence detection if you're able to chain enough things together, because there's some things we saw where literally it was, this chain of events, this executed this, and this executed this, and this executed this, and it's all within the realm of W script, PowerShell, command prompt, run DLL, whatever it is on those like main execution techniques. And it's just so obvious. Like, I think that's sometimes what's frustrating when you look at a report. It Reading the report, you're like, man, I could see this is bad. I know this is bad or whatever. But then when you're, sat in front of a bunch of data or a tool and you're like, what do you look for? You're like, oh man, I don't know. Getting familiar with the things that stand out that that are obvious and being able to replicate that in tools is really the big takeaway there. And that's a good example of it.
Yeah, I guess mine is stay paranoid. Don't trust your computers. You know, but also, if you're going to go for these TTPs, mix, mix of now or have a nice mix of TTP focus paired with baselining, so that again, your environment. Because, like I said, and Tom hit PowerShell encoded commands. That's a legitimate thing now. We got people that are coding, or they're encoding all their programs and stuff. You have legitimate tools that are using PowerShell encoded commands to communicate. So if you and it could be scary because if you're like, I know this is bad, let's run a query, and all of a sudden you have 30,000 hits. I mean, that's a panic attack waiting to happen. But if you sit there and say, okay, this mindset of what does it look like in my environment already? And then say, how have the bad guys used it? And then pair that knowledge, then you'll be able to take a look and you'll understand your environment better. And then you'll be able to understand what to tune out so you could actually see the suspicious or malicious activity.
Yeah. I was going to say the one thing that we didn't mention that was really novel that we saw in 2025 was the leverage of cryptocurrency like ledgers for C2. And I only want to touch on that briefly because for people that aren't familiar with it is, how cryptocurrency is tracked as far as who has what and transactions that occur. There's this public ledger for each cryptocurrency. And in some of the cryptocurrency ledgers, there's places to put, I think, details or notes or whatever it is. But there are specific infrastructure pieces that you would query to get a read of that ledger or to pull down that ledger or whatever it is, right? And we saw something that was very novel when someone used it. And what's novel about it is if you're using cryptocurrency ledgers, it's really hard infrastructure to take down because it's not adversary infrastructure anymore. And it's replicated in so many different ways that it's kind of persistent infrastructure. But how it gets queried, this is when it's good to do some of that research. If this is going to continue to persist as a way that people want to have at least backup C2 capabilities, there are designated domains and IPs that are associated with communicating the ledger information for the different cryptocurrencies. You can do research and find that stuff very easily and then try to model any communication going to it, which would help with crypto mining, kind of defense perspectives, as well as looking at those rare C2 communications that we saw. So I'm just kind of curious if that'll grow in 2026 or it's just kind of a novel thing we saw in 2025.
I'm gonna throw a dart at this as a reckless speculation. Okay, the C2 stuff using the crypto using blockchain was very interesting, and we've seen it leveraged specifically with Solana and Ethereum. And and it was really creative. It was really cool. But it is relatively easy to roll those infrastructure pieces over. So takedown's not necessarily a good approach. But it's not like if you were trying to track IPs and how easy those are to roll over. There are relatively limited number of RPC nodes that you would see call outs to communicate this interaction. Now those do get spun up, and there are a lot of them, but it's not as many. So there's a net that you could cast for that. But reckless speculation, I'd anticipate more than just the C2 infrastructure piece going out, and I fully expect actors to move their as a service type offerings and things like that to the blockchain, because I think a door's been cracked to the capability, the leveraging of this, and the fact that you really can't do anything against it. It's really hard to cover down on. I'm expecting a lot of people to move their infrastructure to the blockchain in creative ways throughout the whole.
I'm going to interrupt you guys in this conversation, but we actually have two very good questions. One, to preface, one trend I have seen is the weaponization of Microsoft application functions and attacks. For example, phishing campaigns have been seen sending calendar invites in Teams. Even if the message is detected as malicious by security tools and remediated, the meeting is still scheduled for the user. Obviously, this is a very low effort or low lift means of bypassing email security measures and reaching targets. The question is, going forward, how should organizations scrutinize their infrastructure to ensure the apps and tools they regularly use are not leveraged in attacks against them?
I'm going to take a first. Yeah, go ahead for it. Go ahead. Okay, I was going to take a first kind of stab at this. So it is tough. What the hell? Okay. It is tough. However, just speaking from the Microsoft side of the house, and this is something that we're growing more focused on too, is that the whole cloud suite of things, right? And most of the Microsoft stuff, including Teams, and it's not easy to get to all the time, but the telemetry exists to where you can you maybe not be able to prevent this piece that you're asking the question for, but you can look down the chain to see what activity is spawned from these things. So like for Teams as example, there is telemetry that exists that you can track, links that are put in stuff, files that are downloaded, users that click the stuff. That telemetry exists out there. You just have to make sure that you have it either enabled or in your environment. I'm not sure from the other side of the cloud stuff too, because we did see stuff on the Google side of the house where calendar invites were being used as backup C2 nodes, so it can send through the calendar invite in the message field. It would actually update the payload to do a thing, and it was pretty unique. But from the Microsoft side, I think that there's ways that you might not be able to stop it at that layer, but you can certainly get gain some ground and the next layer down and looking at the telemetry of what happens. Just one idea. I know that doesn't stop this, but go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, no, I would just, most of what you said, I would echo the same. The one thing it's unique about, especially when you start looking at like services, especially in Azure, it doesn't look like it from the surface, but pay attention to SharePoint logs with Azure, because everything's kind of backed by SharePoint as far as the data structure goes. So there's always interesting artifacts you can see within SharePoint that might tie to those other applications that might give you some headway for like how to potentially deal with some of those things or identify them. But also it's really hard when they have novel ways of like initial access or to try to get in, right? And that's why a lot of times from a hunting perspective, I can't spend too many resources on that. I like to learn or see what are the follow-on effects if there's a capability for that, to see, well, what is it they're trying to do? Is it drop something? What are they trying to drop? Because if you can impede that next step, then that first step, they can change it a million different ways, but they won't be successful unless they completely change their attack on the tail end. And I think that can also be effective. So if you're able to figure out how to learn about those next set of behaviors, that sometimes is a lot easier to answer than the initial question, right?
Just like really directly, because I think we like we always do, we dive into the weeds. But to answer your direct question of how should organizations scrutinize their infrastructure, leveraging those ways. But I just wanted to emphasize on the going forward, create a focus point on the cloud app stuff, because it's becoming more of an attack surface. We are seeing that. We are working on our end to build things around that. It's definitely something that going into 2026 should become a priority for defenders.
Yeah, and one thing I do see a lot of questions about the slides. Something I failed to mention at the beginning was we actually have a report we built based on this whole talk that we will be sending out to people that registered for this podcast. So you guys will get a copy of like the data and things we were showing, and maybe even some additional things that we didn't even touch on. So you'll get a full report. So hopefully you guys are excited about that. And feedback would be great too, because we want to try to make this possibly reoccurring with trying to figure out best ways to add benefit to everybody.
And one more. I think
All right,
this,
bring it.
this sounds like an attribution question. So, how have you reported APT groups? Is it while we were hunting, we found activity connected particularly to a group and then named them, or did you hunt this APT groups using dark web forums? So, if you could, kind of expand on the way we connect the dots as threat hunters.
Yeah, I mean, usually APT groups are always interesting for me because I think there's a lot of benefit to look at like historical reporting. To understand like the strengths of like APT group. Like for instance, I was doing something about Russia in general, and Russia has multiple groups in it, and they kind of target different things or specialize in different things. But one of the things that was interesting looking at overlapping behaviors based on what the intel had to support it was they like to use run DLL to be able to execute things. What they did with it from the different groups was slightly different purpose. One was about trying to get a persistence, one was about trying to execute a payload. But what that tells me and why I think that reporting and cross reporting is so important is APT groups are usually trained, well funded, and they work closely together. And so that means that if their method is to use run DLL in general for different purposes, it means in their training, they probably learned how to use that at some point as part of building up their analyst, their talent, or whatever as a means to do something, which also means that if we haven't seen behavior reported with run DLL 32, um, doing research outside of just that reporting about how you can leverage it or what you can do with it or what other adversaries have done with it is good to kind of build if that's like one of your focuses. That's how the only way I use attribution as far as like before the hunt to figure out what it is I care about. But when I start digging in and finding things, it's nice to be able to match patterns to things, but kind of like what Lee harped on earlier. Sometimes attribution isn't the most important part. It's more of the icing, but CTI groups live for it. So if you have a CTI or dedicated CTI team for threat intelligence, um, it's great when you can give them all the information and really cool artifacts and how you stitch it together, because they live for that. It's exciting. And it actually helps them more with attribution than it would be if it was just going off a single detection and not like walking the process. So I don't know if I fully answered it. That's how I look at it.
Another quick angle from that, APT groups, this is just my personal opinion. So when we consider APT groups, I think where you want to, if and when you want to care about attribution, this is a great place to go. But the thing is with APT groups, I think, is I have historically considered them because there's a lot for most of the big groups. There's a lot of historic intelligence. There's a lot of different intelligence companies and defenders that stitch things to this. There's also a lot of aliases for them, which all of us defenders hate. But when you consider APT groups, they usually have much bigger goals than smash and grab, ransomware, financial gain. They have almost always very specific goals to what Scott alluded to with like some of the Russian APTs. They're generally very, very good at really specific things. And sometimes they collaborate for a specific goal. They're almost always nation state backed in most cases. Like they have big goals to do big things. And it depends on what you're protecting. So this ties right back to know your environment. So if your environment is protecting something like critical infrastructure, you're already going to have them profiled a certain way, or you should. So when you are hunting for it, you're already have some level of applied attribution because you know what you're chasing down. You want to make sure that these guys that you know could target you for big reasons, potentially really big reasons, you're going to consider that attribution at the forefront. So you're going to look for all of their stuff specifically, and that attribution is going to happen organically. not necessarily like as you're working through a hunt, you stitch it to deader. I think you should take that approach if you're concerned about APTs. That's just my opinion, because of the impact that they can have and how focused they are in specific targets.
So knowing that we're kind of coming up on time, Lee, do you want to quickly plug your webinar that you're doing for actual live hunting real quick?
Oh yeah, so we got a level 2 threat hunting workshop for privileged escalation, where basically we use a couple hunt packages from the Hunter platform. We dive into it, we grab or jump into a set of data, and we talk about how to reduce false positives, how to trim out the noise to find a suspicious or malicious activity. It's a real fun, and I encourage you to be there here in Avid Threat Hunter.
And I would say, if you guys enjoyed this type of reporting and what we want to try to do is summarize, we're going to try to do a lot better with how to collect and formulate the data to hopefully create really good talking points and maybe focuses based on like a quarterly basis if we can. So if you guys have any feedback, and especially if you're on the Discord, you can drop your notes and thoughts in there for things you like, things you want to see, things you don't like, any of the above. Please do. Also, keep your eyes out for the report that'll be sent your way. And this kind of concludes, I think, Tom, right? We covered everything we wanted to cover.
Yeah.
Yeah. So concludes our live edition of the Out of the Woods Threat Hunting podcast for the summary review of 2025. So with that, I appreciate everybody for joining and participating, and happy hunting.
Happy hunting, everyone.